Good morning. This is Ron. It is Thursday, May the 3rd. Welcome to Story Time. So, one of the things I've been thinking about is rhinos and Republicans in name only. And it should be actually sinos or kinos, conservatives in name only, because that's the way they really run. The Republican Party, the Democrat Party, I mean, it has its conventions and it has a platform and there's planks in the platform, et cetera, et cetera. But not too many people really pay any attention to that and run as a true Democrat or Republican running on the party platform. They kind of do their own thing. And most of the people in the Republican Party run as conservatives. They try to convince everybody how conservative they are. And so you had two Republican presidents that ran as conservatives and were nothing of the sort in reality, and that was both of the Bushes, Bush the first and Bush the second. So with both of the Bushes, they were closer to being socialists than they were to being Republicans or especially conservatives, because we got two of the biggest left wing programs out of the Bushes that we've gotten since probably the New Deal back in Lyndon Johnson's day, back in the 60s. For George the First, he was the one that came up with the Americans with Disabilities Act and the idea that you can't discriminate against people with disabilities. And again, I'm sure he did this more as a legacy, kind of a legacy thing, because I mean he was always a bit of a sissy, anyways. He was drawn by a his caricature was drawn by a guy named Oliphant in editorial cartoons, and he's always pictured carrying a purse. And that's basically the way the guy was. As soon as he was elected the first time, he went, well, the one and only time, he he of course ran as a conservative, and read my lips, no new taxes, and all that good stuff. But as soon as he got his inaugural address going, the first thing he did was slap Ronald Reagan in the face by talking about being kinder and gentler. And there's no doubt that what his meaning was kinder and gentler than his predecessor, suggesting that his predecessor was, in his opinion, mean. And Ronald Reagan was nothing of the sort. And then this 1,000 points of light crap. He was just ridiculous that way. So and he comes up with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is, again, it's just you have the Voting Rights Act, and you have the various civil rights acts from the 60s, legit. And then, of course, he wants to be, it seems, part of that and have his own legacy attached to some kind of uh, create his own civil rights kind of program with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then you had his son, who ruled from 2000 to 2008, who came up with another big socialist program, giveaway program, and it was probably more socialistic than his father's Americans with Disabilities Act, and that was the drugs for seniors, going ahead and creating a government program to pay for prescription medication for seniors. He did nothing, and I don't think he even looked at any ideas of trying to find free market solutions to, and actually realizing that the more the government gets involved in things in markets, in free markets, the more it has a tendency to skew the dynamics of that market. So you have the government that gets in and tries to regulate something, it necessarily raises the prices of that very thing. And if you want to look at prescriptions and the reasons that the prescriptions are going up, 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 and out of and not in accordance with, not because of inflation, then you got to look at the government and what the government's been doing with prescriptions. The same thing with medicine, where because of Social Security, Medicare, the government is able to um, keep the prices low for seniors, but those prices have to go somewhere. So everybody else gets to start picking up the tab for seniors, and so that makes medicine more expensive for everybody else. When people start complaining about that, then the federal government says, "Oh, well, we got to do something about it, so we'll come up with the Affordable Care Act," and it's always more government, more political party involvement, more Democrat or Republicans making rules and regulations, and never less, when less is really the answer. The best thing that we could do for healthcare in this country is to get rid of HMOs. There was no damn reason to create the law that created HMOs. There was no reason for it. We had a perfectly good healthcare market where doctors would what they call put out a shingle, which means put their name on a door in an office somewhere. You would go to that doctor, and you had to a lot like what you see with dentists now. You know, there's a lot of dental offices that you can go to. You can see them all over town, various dental offices, and it used to be that way with doctors, and the way you see with lawyers as well, where you can go all over town and see, oh, there's a lawyer's office, there's a dentist's office. It used to be that you'd see doctors' offices too. So you pick a doctor, and then you could compare prices. This doctor's charging too much for lab work or whatever, and find a doctor that's good for you. Then all the insurance companies wanted a piece of the action, and the way they sold their program, the idea of having insurance companies take over the healthcare market, was by insisting that they would be able to control costs and drive prices down. And exactly the opposite happened, where they tried to cut costs, and they did it by trying to deny care, which of course drove everybody insane because I'm paying up front. The way it used to be when you had doctors that you dealt with directly was you paid afterwards. You go, you see the doc, you make an appointment, see the doctor. Doctor said gives you your checkup or whatever, and then on your way out, you go to the receptionist and you pay for the doctor's care. Now with insurance companies, you're paying ahead of time. You're paying monthly premiums, and then every 6 months or once a year, you go in for your checkup, and so the insurance company is then trying to cut costs by saying, "Oh, by the way, you've got a problem, but we're not going to go ahead and approve you for to go see a specialist, for instance, in order to try to keep costs down." Well, that's just all that serves to do is just make people furious. That's exactly what happened. You had that lunatic that went out on the Pasadena freeway, or not Pasadena, L.A. freeway, and blew his brains out with a shotgun because he had some kind of incurable disease that his insurance company wasn't going to pay for the treatment for. So what eventually, and little by little, the insurance company started giving in, until now you're in a situation where it's worse than it was before, because now the insurance companies are terrified of saying no to people because they're afraid of the backlash. So now they're approving everything that comes down the pike, and so prices are skyrocketing. So the answer, obviously, at that particular point is to say, you know what, the HMO experiment failed. So what do? We go back to the way things were before we did this stupid experiment, which was unnecessary. And this goes back to the idea of making the presumption for the status quo and making damn sure that there is an obvious case for change, which there was not when we were dealing with doctors. When you're dealing directly with a doctor, you didn't have, there was no reason other than the greed of the insurance companies to change. And so the answer to that should have been no, we're not going to change it. We're not going to go ahead and set up a system whereby everything's going to be great for the insurance companies, but it's going to suck for everybody else. But that's because we made the presumption for change instead of making the presumption for the status quo. That's how we ended up with HMOs. And again, the answer is do away with the HMOs, go back to the way it was before HMOs. The other thing that's interesting is, and was a consequence, a direct consequence of having HMOs, if you ever notice, if you call your HMO, first thing you're going to hear when you call is a recording. And one of the recordings is going to say, if you have an emergency, hang up and dial 911, especially if you're dialing after hours, right? So what they're doing is they're shunting all of their patients to where? Exactly, the emergency rooms. The emergency rooms that all of a sudden, mysteriously, nobody could figure it out. Why are all the emergency rooms clogged? Why is it taking 4 hours to get to see a doctor when you're sitting in the emergency room? And then some people had the stones to blame illegal aliens for the problem, saying, well, it's all the illegal aliens. And probably that was probably a rumor started by the insurance companies, who probably knew damn well why it is that the emergency rooms were backed up, but didn't want to admit it because they don't want to see their cash cow called HMOs go away. So, but the truth of the matter is, that's why our emergency rooms have been clogged and probably still are clogged to this day. We don't hear much about it anymore, but I'm sure that's the situation. Now, as evidence of that, and I remember when I was a kid and we had to go see, we had a medical emergency, and the first thing that my parents did was not call 911. First they did is they called the doctor. This was, I think, on a weekend, and the doctor, we got a hold of the doctor. Doctor said, "I'll meet you at my office." Okay, there was a time in which doctors actually made house calls. You call the doctor after hours, and the doctor would come see you. Anyway, so we go to his office, we meet him. He doesn't like the situation the way I look, so he says, "Take Ron to the hospital. Take him to admitting. I will meet you there." And notice that he said admitting, not to the emergency room. And the doctor was there. He went to the hospital. He had my charts. He had everything ready. He got me admitted to the hospital. All I did was roll up. They had a lady, a nurse or whatever, waiting for me with a wheelchair. Boom. I put me in the wheelchair, wheeled me upstairs to my room. I didn't go to the emergency room. I went to admitting. And I was admitted to the hospital right away. Much more efficient. So much better. And again, if we want things to be better, less expensive, more efficient, quit the HMOs. Get rid of the damn HMOs, the damn insurance companies, and go back to the way things were before. So, but anyways, that was a kind of a side rant there. But it was, there's George Bush, who's supposed to be the compassionate conservative, who is should be finding market solutions for various problems rather than saying it's okay, we'll just have the taxpayers foot the bill for this new entitlement program, which is probably going to be very, very difficult, of course, now to get rid of. It's going to be another third rail of politics. You touch it and you die kind of thing. So no thank you to both the Bushes, Bush the first, Bush the second, and it goes back to illustrate the point Ayn Rand was making, and that is that the whole reason that we still have socialism as a viable political entity in this country is thanks to rhinos like Bush the first and Bush the second. Okay, when we come back, it's going to be the part 2 of the last chapter of Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? Okay, so we're back, and so the last chapter is called "Don't Let It Go," and basically what it's about is saying that this is a country that has a lot of potential and a lot of unrealized potential, and that one of the ways that we can get into a dictatorship or a socialistic um, situation here in this country is by not so much by the force of the left, but by the apathy of the right. Let's see. An American economist told me the following story. He was sent to England by an American industrial concern to investigate its European branch. In spite of the latest equipment and techniques, the productivity of the branch in England kept lagging far behind that of the parent company in the US. He found the cause: a rigidly circumscribed mentality, a kind of psychological caste system on all the echelons of British labor and management. As he explained it, in America, if a machine breaks down, a worker volunteers to fix it, and usually does. In England, work stops and people wait for the appropriate department to summon the appropriate engineer. It's not a matter of laziness, but of a profoundly ingrained feeling that one must keep one's place, do one's prescribed duty, and never venture beyond it. It does not occur to the British worker that he is free to assume responsibility for anything beyond the limits of his particular job. Initiative is an instinctive, i.e., automatized American characteristic. It is an American consciousness. It occupies the place which, in a European one, is occupied by obedience. As to the differences in the social atmosphere, here is an example. An elderly European woman, a research biochemist from Switzerland, on a visit to New York, told me that she wanted to buy some things at the 5 and 10. Since she could barely speak English, I offered to go with her. She hesitated, looking astonished and disturbed, then asked, "But wouldn't that embarrass you?" I couldn't understand what she meant. Embarrass? How? "Well," she explained, "you're a famous person, and what if somebody sees you in the 5 and 10?" I laughed. She explained to me that in Switzerland, by unwritten law, there are different stores for different classes of people, and that she, as a professional, has to shop in certain stores, even though her salary is modest. That better stores at lower prices are available in the working man's stores, but she would lose social status if she were seen shopping there. Can you conceive of living in an atmosphere of that kind? We did go to the 5 and 10. A European, on any social level, lives emotionally in a world made by others, he never knows clearly by whom, and seeks or accepts his place in it. The American attitude is best expressed by a line from a poem. Quote, "The world began when I was born, and the world is mine to win." Unquote. By Badger Clark from The Westerner. Years ago at a party in Hollywood, I met Eve Curie, a distinguished French woman, the daughter of Marie Curie. Eve Curie was a best-selling author of nonfiction books and politically a liberal at the time. She was on a lecture tour of the United States. She stressed her astonishment at American audiences. "They are so happy," she kept repeating. "So happy." She was saying it without disapproval and without admiration, with only the faintest touch of amusement. But her astonishment was genuine. People are not like that in Europe. Everybody's happy in America, except the intellectuals. Oh, the intellectuals are unhappy everywhere. This incident has remained in my mind because she had named, unwittingly, the nature of the breach between the American people and the intellectuals. The culture of a worn, crumbling Europe, with its mysticism, its lethargic resignation, its cult of suffering, its notion that misery and impotence are man's lot on earth, and that unhappiness is the hallmark of a sensitive spirit. Of what use could it be to a country like America? It was a European who discovered America, but it was an Americans who were the first nation to discover this earth and man's proper place in it, and man's potential for happiness, and the world which is man's to win. What they failed to discover is the world's words to name their achievement, the concepts to identify it, the principles to guide it, i.e., the appropriate philosophy, and in consequence, an American culture. America has never had an original culture, i.e., a body of ideas derived from her philosophical Aristotelian base and expressing her profound difference from all other countries in history. American intellectuals were Europe's passive dependents and poor relatives almost from the beginning. They lived on Europe's drying crumbs and discarded fashions, including even such hand me downs as Freud and Wittgenstein. America's sole contribution to philosophy, pragmatism, was a bad recycling of Kantian Hegelian premises. America's best minds went into science, technology, industry, and reached incomparable heights of achievement. Why did they neglect the field of ideas? Because it represented Augean stables of a kind no joyously active man would care to enter. America's childhood coincided with the rise of Kant's influence in European philosophy and the consequent disintegration of European culture. America was in the position of an eager, precocious child left in the care of a scruffy, senile, decadent guardian. The child had good reason to play hooky. An adolescent can ride on his sense of life for a while, but by the time he grows up, he must translate it into conceptual knowledge and conscious convictions, or he will be in deep trouble. A sense of life is not a substitute for explicit knowledge. Values which one cannot identify but merely senses implicitly are not in one's control. One cannot tell what they depend or require, what course of action is needed to gain and or keep them. One can lose or betray them without knowing it. For close to a century, this has been America's tragic predicament. Today, the American people is like a sleepwalking giant torn by profound conflicts. When I speak of the American people in this context, I mean every group, including scientists and businessmen, except the intellectuals, i.e., those whose professions deal with the humanities. The intellectuals are a country's guardians. Americans are the most reality oriented people on earth. Their outstanding characteristic is the childhood form of reasoning, common sense. It is their only protection. But common sense is not enough where theoretical knowledge is required. It can make single, concrete bound connections. It cannot integrate complex issues or deal with wide abstractions or forecast the future. For example, consider the statist trend in this country. The doctrine of collectivism has never been submitted explicitly to the American workers. If it had been, it would have been sustained an incredible defeat, as the various socialist parties have demonstrated. But the welfare state was put over on Americans piecemeal, by degrees, under cover of some unidentified Americanism, culminating in the absurdity of a president's declaration that America owes its greatness to, quote, the willingness for self-sacrifice, unquote. People sense that something has gone wrong. They cannot grasp what or when. This is the penalty they pay for remaining a silent and deaf majority. Americans are anti-intellectual with good grounds in view of current specimens, yet they have a profound respect for knowledge and education, which is being shaken now. They are self-confident, trusting, generous, enormously benevolent, and innocent. The celebrated American innocence is a quality which, in philosophical terms, is simply an ignorance of how questionable a being man really is, and which strikes the European as alien. Declares an existentialist, William Barrett, Irrational Man. The word questionable is a euphemism for miserable, guilty, impotent, groveling, evil, which is the European view of men. Europeans do believe in original sin, i.e., in man's innate depravity. Americans do not. Americans see man as a value, as clean, free, creative, rational. But the American view of man has not been expressed or upheld in philosophical terms, not since the time of our first founding father, Aristotle. See his description in The Magnanimous Man. Barrett continues, quote, Sartre recounts a conversation he had with an American while visiting in this country. The American insisted that all international problems should be solved if men would just get together and be rational. Sartre disagreed, and after a while discussion between them became impossible. I believe in the existence of evil, says Sartre, and he does not. This, again, is a euphemism, and he does not unquote. This is, again, a euphemism. It's not merely the existence but the power of evil that Europeans believe in. Americans do not believe in the power of evil and do not understand its nature. The first part of their attitude is philosophically true, but the second makes them vulnerable. On the day when Americans grasp the cause of evil's impotence, its mindless, fear ridden, envy eaten smallness, they will be free of all the man hating manipulators of history, foreign and domestic. So far, America's protection has been a factor best expressed by a saying attributed to con men: you can't cheat an honest man. The innocence and common sense of the American people have wrecked the plans, the devious actions, the tricky strategies, the ideological traps borrowed by the intellectuals from the European statists, who devised them to fool and rule Europe's impotent masses. There have never been any masses in America. The poorest American is an individual and, subconsciously, an individualist. Marxism, which has conquered our universities, is a dismal failure as far as the people are concerned. Americans cannot be sold on any sort of class war. American workers do not see themselves as proletariat, but are among the proudest of property owners. It is professors and businessmen who advocate cooperation with Soviet Russia. American labor unions do not. The enormous propaganda effort to make Americans fear fascism but not communism has failed. Americans hate them both. The terrible hoax of the United Nations has failed. Americans were never enthusiastic about that institution, but they gave it the benefit of the doubt for too long. The current polls, however, indicate that the majority have turned against the UN. Better late than never. The latest assault on human life, the ecology crusade, will probably end in defeat for its ideological leadership. Americans will enthusiastically clean their streets, their rivers, their backyards, but when it comes to giving up progress, technology, the automobile, and their standard of living, Americans will prove that the man-haters, quote, ain't seen nothing yet, unquote. The sense of life emotion which, in Europe, makes people uncertain, malleable, and easy to rule is unknown in America. Fundamental guilt. No one, so far, has been able to infect America with that contemptible feeling, and I doubt that anyone ever will. Americans cannot begin to grasp the kind of corruption implied and demanded by that feeling. But an honest man can cheat himself. His trusting innocence can lead him to swallow sugar-coated poisons, the deadliest of which is altruism. Americans accept it not for what it is, not as a vicious doctrine of self-immolation, but in the spirit of a strong, confident man's over-generous desire to relieve the suffering of others, whose character he does not understand. When such a man awakens to the betrayal of his trust, to the fact that his generosity has brought him within reach of a permanent harness which is about to be slipped on him by his sundry beneficiaries, the consequences are unpredictable. There are two ways of destroying a country: dictatorship or chaos, i.e., immediate rigor mortis or the longer agony of the collapse of all civilized institutions and the breakup of a nation into roving armed gangs fighting and looting one another until one Attila conquers the rest. This means chaos is a prelude to tyranny, as was the case in Western Europe in the Dark Ages or in the 100 years preceding the Romanov dynasty in Russia or under the warlords regime in China. A European is disarmed in the face of a dictatorship. He may hate it, but he feels that he is wrong and metaphysically the state is right. An American would rebel to the bottom of his soul, but this is all that his sense of life can do for him. It cannot solve his problems. Only one thing is certain: a dictatorship cannot take hold in America today. This country, as yet, cannot be ruled, but it can explode. It can blow up into the helpless rage and blind violence of a civil war. It cannot be cowed into submission, passivity, malevolence, resignation. It cannot be pushed around. Defiance, not obedience, is the American's answer to overbearing authority. The nation that ran an underground railroad to help human beings escape from slavery or began drinking on principle in the face of prohibition will not say yes, sir, to the enforcers of ration coupons and cereal prices. Not yet. If America drags on in her present state for a few more generations, which is unlikely, dictatorship will become possible. A sense of life is not a permanent endowment. The characteristically American one is being eroded daily all around us. Large numbers of Americans have lost it or have never developed it and are collapsing to the psychological level of Europe's worst rabble. This is prevalent among two groups that are the main supporters of the statist trend, the very rich and the very poor. The first because they want to rule, the second because they want to be ruled. The leaders of the trend are the intellectuals who want to do both. But this country has never had an unearned hereditary elite. America is still a country of self-made men, which means the country of the middle class, the most productive and exploited group in any modern society. The academia jet set coalition is attempting to tame the American character by the deliberate breeding of helplessness and resignation in those incubators of lethargy known as progressive schools, which are dedicated to the task of crippling a child's mind by arresting his cognitive development. See the Comprachicos in my book, The New Left, The Anti-Industrial Revolution. It appears, however, that the progressive rich will be the first victims of their own social theories. It is the children of the well-to-do who emerge from expensive nursery schools and colleges as hippies and destroy the remnants of their paralyzed brains by means of drugs. The middle class has created an antidote which is perhaps the most helpful movement of recent years. The spontaneous, unorganized, grassroots revival of the Montessori system of education, a system aimed at the development of a child's cognitive, i.e., rational faculty. But that is a long-range prospect. At present, even so dismal a figure as President Nixon is a hopeful sign, precisely because he is so dismal. If any other country were in as desperately precarious state of confusion as ours, a dozen flamboyant Führers would have sprung up overnight to take it over. It is America's credit that no such Führer has appeared, and if any did, it is doubtful that he would have a chance. Can this country achieve a peaceful rebirth in the foreseeable future? By all precedents, it's not likely. But America is an unprecedented phenomenon. In the past, American perseverance became, on occasion, too long-bearing a patience. But when Americans turned, they turned. What may happen to the welfare state is what happened to the Prohibition Amendment. Is there enough of the American sense of life left in people under the constant pressure of the cultural political efforts to obliterate it? It is impossible to tell. But those of us who hold it must fight for it. We have no alternative. We cannot surrender this country to a zero, to men whose battle cry is mindlessness. We cannot fight against collectivism unless we fight against its moral base, altruism. We cannot fight against altruism unless we fight against its epistemological base, irrationalism. We cannot fight against anything unless we fight for something, and what we must fight for is the supremacy of reason and a view of man as a rational being. There are philosophical issues. The philosophy we need is a conceptual equivalent of America's sense of life. To propagate it would require the hardest intellectual battle. But isn't that a magnificent goal to fight for? And that's the conclusion not only of the final chapter, chapter 18, but of the book Philosophy Who Needs It by Ayn Rand. And the one little thing that I wanted to add here says we cannot fight against altruism unless we fight against its epistemological base. Irrationalism, we cannot fight against anything unless we fight for something, and we must fight for what we must fight for is the supremacy of reason and a view of man as a rational being. And again, I'm not an objectivist. I've never been an objectivist because objectivism is wrong. Ayn Rand went wrong. The biggest mistake she ever made in her life was in creating objectivism. Because as soon as she created objectivism, she ceased to be objective. And that's the point, or the overall point that she's trying to make, is to be objective. Okay, to be realistic. And that's why I say that I am the only true conservative in the United States, perhaps in the world, because the most realistic thing, the most objective thing anyone can do is make the presumption for the status quo. And when I come back, a little critique of Rush Limbaugh. Okay, and we're back. So this is going to be from yesterday, May 2nd, from his show. Poll shock: 46% favor government jobs for all. And I'm reading this from he has an app, a Rush Limbaugh app. Rasmussen reports Trump's approval rating is down a couple of points. Margin of error 51-49. But there's another area of the Rasmussen report I haven't talked about another area of the Rasmussen report. I haven't talked about this yet because, frankly, I must confess, I thought this is one of those things that nobody's going to even take seriously. So I didn't mention it. Crazy Bernie is resetting his table to seek the presidency Democratic nomination in 2020. One of the ideas that Bernie Sanders has put forth is a guaranteed federal job and health care. Bernie Sanders is essentially saying this administration will guarantee full employment. Everybody will have a job, and those that somehow do not get a job in the private sector will be hired by government. However many it is, whatever work it is or is not to be done, doesn't matter. The federal government essentially pay people that they would be paid if they were working, and they would be provided health care. So Rasmussen decided to poll this, and this is shocking. 46% of the Rasmussen poll say they support this idea. And Rush Limbaugh is shocked. And we got the first thing that I wanted to say about this was that Rush Limbaugh helps to contribute to this, so he shouldn't be shocked if he has any ability to kind of look at himself in the mirror, look at himself in a critical way, him and the entire conservative pundit set, but especially Rush Limbaugh, then he shouldn't be um, shocked about the fact that 46% of the people like this idea. Because, and I say that he is going ahead and he's responsible for this because when you look at this situation, what is Bernie Sanders offering? He's offering something for nothing. Okay, he says that hey, everybody should have a job, and so we're going to go ahead and give everybody a job. If you're unemployed and you can't find a job in the private sector, damn it, the federal government will give you a job, and you'll have health care. And so what is he doing there? Is he's offering you something for nothing. You don't have to pay for it in any way, shape, or form, or at least that's the illusion, because of course taxpayers are going to have to pay for that, and so hopefully we'll get to find out exactly how much this is going to cost. But it's creating the illusion of getting something for nothing. And it used to be in the United States of America, part of American culture was the idea that you never accepted a handout. You never accepted a freebie. It just wasn't done. It was a cultural no-no. Okay, if somebody came up to you and said, "Hey, I got such and such for free," sorry, no, thank you. The idea was, I want to earn everything I own. I accept nothing for free. There's a saying, there's no such thing as a free lunch, which is true. If you accept something free from somebody, then you put yourself in a position of being automatically obligated to that person for whatever that person wants to uh, charge for it. Somebody gives me $50 and then, or gives me something that's maybe more intangible, a job, some equipment that I can use to plow my fields or something like that, and then they can come back later and say, "Hey, you owe me. If it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have a farm. If it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have food on the table." And they can, in a manner of speaking, then, well, it's like having a loan. And so now, again, the person comes back, demands repayment, and might demand repayment for quite a while. Okay, every time they want something from you, they might come back and remind you, guess what? You owe me because I helped you out. So Rush Limbaugh contributes to that because if you listen to his show, he loves to give away iPhones and iPads. Okay, he doesn't give them away as a prize in a contest in which you are earning it in a certain way. He just gives them away. He said, somebody calls up, and you, especially at Christmas time, Somebody calls up and he says, "Oh, great. Hey, what kind of iPhone do you want? What color? What size? What shape? What uh, cell phone company are you with? AT&T, fine. We'll get all that set up," and just gives it away. And so he contributes to the sense that is now pervasive in this country, which is if you can get something for nothing, you're crazy not to take it. Okay. So if you already have that mental attitude, and somebody like Bernie Sanders comes along and says that he's going to give you something for nothing, and something like a federal job. Gee, if you're a federal job, and that federal job means that maybe you're going to be in a union, so you have this nifty conflict of interest, but you're in a union, and so it's going to be very difficult to fire you. Wow. Why would I? And you've been told that accepting something for nothing is a great idea. Only idiots would turn it down. What are you going to do? Well, of course, 46% of Americans say that's a swell idea. So the first thing that has to be done is to re-emphasize the idea that there is no free lunch, and that no good American would accept something for nothing. And to that end, Rush Limbaugh needs to quit handing out free iPhones and free iPads. Okay. Again, if Mr. Limbaugh wants to have influence in this country, then he has to have maximum integrity, maximum credibility in order to have maximum influence. If he, on the one hand, says that he's a conservative and he can't stand giveaway programs, but on the other hand, he acts like a socialist and gives things away, no wonder he has very little integrity, very little credibility, and very little influence. At the end of the day, people are going to refuse to take him seriously. They're going to refuse to listen to him. So, for his own sake, and to a certain extent for the sake of the country, he really needs to um, knock it off. The second part of this was I just got done reading Ayn Rand's last chapter, in which she had said, because of the sense of life in this country, that in Europe, for instance, that when things get shaky, six or half a dozen or so of these charismatic leaders would pop up and say, "Hey, choose me to run your life and to run the government," and volunteering to be dictators. And she said, "Well, that's never going to happen in this country," but that's exactly what is happening in the form of Bernie Sanders. And to a lesser, not so much Trump, although Trump is also a populist, but Trump isn't as interested in, he's not interested in being a dictator. His interests are in changing the country more on the margins, whereas in Saunders' case, he wants to fundamentally transform this country. It is Saunders that's really not Hillary Clinton, but Bernie Saunders that is the riding the coattails of Barack Obama, because Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, was the one that said he was going to fundamentally transform this country. I think that he failed to do that, and that President Trump, is turning back a lot of the changes that he did make. But there's, again, candidate Bernie Sanders, who is prepared to pick up where President Obama left off. So when we come back, it's going to be time for the New York City Joke Book. Well, actually, I'm back, and it's actually the New York City Cab Drivers joke book by Jim Peach. An elephant is walking through the jungle when she accidentally steps on a thorn. She's in great pain, but try as she might, she just can't get the thorn out. She tries to get it out with her foot, but you know how elephant feet are. They don't even have fingers. She tries with her trunk, but even that doesn't work. She doesn't know what to do. Just then a little mouse walks by. Desperate, the elephant calls to him, little mouse, can you please help me?" The mouse walks over and asks, "What can I do?" "I've stepped on this thorn," says the elephant, "and I just can't get it out. Can you help me? I would do anything for you in return. Anything." "Anything?" asked the mouse, his eyebrows raised. Anything, says the elephant. So the little mouse goes over to the elephant's foot, and with both hands, and using all his might, he pulls and tugs at the thorn. Suddenly, he yanks it loose. The elephant sighs with great relief. Thank you, she says. Oh, thank you. That's so much better. I can't thank you enough. Is there anything I can do for you? Well, says the mouse, you said anything, right? Anything, replies the elephant. Well, says the little mouse, I've been sort of checking you out in the jungle here for quite a while now, and actually, I sort of have the hots for you. So what I'd really like is to make it with you. The elephant looks at the mouse incredulously. You, a little mouse, want to make it with me, an elephant? The mouse nods. That's right. Well, says the elephant, half smiling to herself, help yourself. So the little mouse goes around to the back of the elephant and climbs up her back leg. He gets on top and he starts going at it. Once he gets going, he's really having a grand old time. He's just wailing away back there. Meanwhile, a monkey in a tree just above them happens to look down and sees what's going on and thinks it's the funniest thing he's ever seen in his life. The monkey starts laughing hysterically, and he shakes so much that a coconut comes loose from the tree he's sitting in, falls down, and hits the elephant on the head with a wallop. She throws her head back and cries in pain, "Oh!" The little mouse looks down at her and says, "Take it all, bitch." Did you hear about the new law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe? A traveling salesman goes to a farm, and he drives up the road to the farmhouse. He sees a pig with a wooden leg in the yard. When the salesman gets to the house and meets the farmer, he asks him, "Say, what's the story behind that pig with the wooden leg?" "Funny you should mention it," says the farmer, "but that pig is the greatest pig I've ever had. One time I was doing the chores in the barn when I happened to doze off. Suddenly the barn caught fire. This pig," says the farmer, eyes welling up with tears, "broke out of his pen, came into the burning barn, nudged me awake, and pulled me to safety. He saved my life." "Yes, I understand," says the salesman. "That's wonderful, but that still doesn't explain to me why the pig has a wooden leg." "Well," says the farmer, a special pig like that you don't eat all at once." Did you hear about the man who had a penis transplant? His hand rejected it. And that concludes this episode of Story Time. And until tomorrow, thank you very much for joining me and have a great day.